Apartheid, a word that sends chills down your spine, a word synonymous with discrimination, segregation and injustice. In the Afrikaans language, it simply means apartness. But in the context of South Africa, it represented a brutal system of racial segregation that lasted for almost 5 decades. From 1948 to 1994, apartheid laws divided people based on their race, stripping away basic human rights and freedoms from the majority black population. Imagine a world where your skin color determined where you could live, work, and even love. A world where you were treated as a second-class citizen in your own country. That was the harsh reality of apartheid in South Africa. It was a system built on the belief that white people were superior to black people, and it permeated every aspect of society. The legacy of apartheid continues to cast a long shadow over South Africa, but the story of apartheid is not just a story of oppression. It is also a story of incredible courage, resilience, and the triumph of the human spirit in the face of adversity. It is a story that reminds us that even in the darkest of times, hope can emerge, and change is always possible. To understand apartheid, we need to go back to 1948. After World War II, the world was grappling with the horrors of Nazi Germany and its ideology of racial purity. Yet, in South Africa, a party with similar ideologies was about to take power. This was the National Party, and their platform was built on the promise of apartheid. The National Party won the 1948 election, largely due to the anxieties of the white minority population. They feared economic competition and perceived threats from the black majority. The National Party capitalized on these fears, promising to protect white privilege and maintain racial segregation. Once in power, the National Party wasted no time in enacting their segregationist agenda. They began to implement a series of laws that would systematically disenfranchise and dehumanize black South Africans. This marked the beginning of a dark chapter in South African history. The National Party wasted no time in constructing the legal framework of apartheid. One of the first and most insidious laws was the Population Registration Act of 1950. This law classified every citizen by race, effectively dividing the nation into racial categories. This classification determined every aspect of a person's life, from where they could live to who they could marry. The Group Areas Act of 1950 followed, a law that forcibly removed black South Africans from their homes and relocated them to segregated areas. This act ripped apart communities and families, leaving deep scars on the social fabric of the nation. Further laws, like the Prohibition of Mixed Marriages Act and the Immorality Act, prohibited relationships and marriage between people of different races. It was a brutal attempt to engineer society along racial lines, denying basic human rights and freedoms to millions. Imagine this. You wake up in a cramped, overcrowded shack. The air is thick with smoke from coal fires, the only source of heat in your segregated township. Your family shares a single tap and toilet with several other families. This was the reality for millions of black South Africans under apartheid. Every aspect of life was dictated by race. Black people were relegated to menial jobs, denied access to quality education, and excluded from public spaces reserved for whites only. Hospitals, parks, beaches, even benches were segregated, marked with signs that served as constant reminders of their inferior status. The humiliation and degradation were relentless. Black people were required to carry passports, internal passports that restricted their movement. Failure to produce a passport on demand could lead to arrest, detention, or worse. Section 5. Voices of Defiance. The rise of resistance movements. Despite the oppressive atmosphere, a spirit of resistance began to flicker. Black South Africans refused to accept their fate passively. They organized, mobilized, and resisted, demanding their rightful place in their own country.
The African National Congress, formed in 1912, became the leading voice of the anti-apartheid movement. We organized peaceful protest strikes and civil disobedience campaigns, challenging the very foundations of the apartheid regime.
Figures like Nelson Mandela, Walter Sisulu, and Oliver Tambo emerged as powerful leaders. They inspired hope in the hearts of the oppressed and became symbols of resistance against racial tyranny. Section 6. Sharpeville's Cry, a turning point in the fight. March 21, 1960, a date etched in the memory of South Africa. On this day, the peaceful township of Sharpeville became a symbol of the brutality of the apartheid regime. Thousands of protesters gathered outside the police station, peacefully demonstrating against the hated pass laws.
The police, armed and afraid, opened fire on the unarmed crowd. 69 people were killed, many shot in the back as they fled.
The Sharpeville Massacre, as it came to be known, sent shockwaves through South Africa and the world. The massacre exposed the true nature of the apartheid regime, shattering any illusions of peaceful reform. It ignited a new wave of anger and resistance, both within South Africa and internationally. Section 7. The world takes notice. International condemnation grows. The Sharpeville Massacre was a turning point. The world could no longer ignore the atrocities of apartheid. International condemnation was swift and widespread. The United Nations denounced the massacre, and countries began to impose sanctions on South Africa. The South African government became increasingly isolated on the world stage. Sporting events were boycotted, cultural ties were severed, and foreign investment dried up. The pressure on the apartheid regime was mounting. Inside South Africa, the struggle continued. The ANC and other liberation movements, despite being banned, operated underground, organizing acts of sabotage against government installations. The fight for freedom was far from over.
The world reacted with horror. We could not stand by while such injustices were happening. The international community had to act.
Section 8. Mandela's Long Walk, a symbol of hope and resilience. In 1964, Nelson Mandela and several other ANC leaders were arrested and sentenced to life imprisonment. Mandela, once the face of the resistance, became a symbol of hope and defiance for millions around the world. Imprisoned on Robben Island, a maximum security prison off the coast of Cape Town, Mandela endured years of hardship and isolation. Yet his spirit remained unbroken. From his prison cell, he became an international icon, a symbol of the struggle against apartheid.
Even in the darkest moments, I knew that our struggle was just. The flame of freedom could not be extinguished.
Section 9. The Walls Crumble, dismantling apartheid. The 1980s witnessed a surge in internal unrest and international pressure against apartheid. Sanctions were biting, the economy was struggling, and the government was facing increasing internal resistance. In 1990, after 27 years in prison, Nelson Mandela walked free. His release marked a turning point in South African history. It signaled the beginning of the end of apartheid. Negotiations began between the government and the ANC, leading to the dismantling of apartheid legislation.
My release was not just my freedom, but the dawn of a new era for all South Africans. It was time to build a nation based on equality and justice.
Section 10. A New Dawn, Freedom's Embrace in 1994. On April 27, 1994, South Africa held its first democratic elections. For the first time in the country's history, all South Africans, regardless of race, were allowed to vote. It was a moment of immense joy and celebration, the culmination of years of struggle and sacrifice. The ANC won a landslide victory, and Nelson Mandela became South Africa's first black president. His election marked the beginning of a new era of hope, reconciliation, and rebuilding.
Our long walk to freedom has finally reached its destination. This is a new dawn for our beloved country. Together, we will create a future of peace, equality, and prosperity for all.